Welcome to the Draft Board Hockey Show, where we talk exclusively about NHL draft prospects. My name is Mark, and I'm joined by my co-host Link. And we have a very special guest today, Scott Wheeler from The Athletic, who covers NHL content. Thanks for coming out there, Scott.
Thanks for having me, fellas. How you doing?
Great. Summer is almost ended, which means that hockey season is upon us.
Yeah.
And so today's episode, we are going to discuss everything about the 2026 NHL draft class. And actually, Scott, you just released your top 32 plus honorable mentions on The Athletic. So if you haven't seen that, go check that out right away. Great list. Loved it. And so, Scott, this draft class, let's talk about them. How they compare to, years prior, I guess you could say.
Well, I think we were spoiled in 2023 and 2024 in particular. Last year was a bit of a weaker class, but 2023 and 2024 were excellent, I would say, classes. And 2024 really emerged to be that. 2023, I think we knew it was going to be that way with Connor Bedard and Adam Fantilli and Leo Carlson and Will Smith and Matvei Michkov. We sort of knew going into 2023 that the top of that draft class was crystallized and was legit sort of all high-end players. 2024, it really took a lot of players to join Macklin Celebrini for it to become what it did. And I think it's going to be looked back on as a really strong draft class, especially on D, obviously with Artie Levshunov and Zeke Boyum and Zane Parekh and Ivan Demidov really emerged in that class. And it became, because of what Celebrini also became, it became a really strong class as well at the top, ran about 12 prospects deep. This year doesn't feel that way to me. Gavin McKenna is Gavin McKenna. Gavin McKenna is a elite prospect. I don't know whether he'll finish the year quite in that sort of Celebrini Bedard stratosphere, but I think he'll be close. He's kind of chasing Celebrini in a little bit of a way because Celebrini had that 60-point freshman year. We'll see whether McKenna is capable of getting to that level. McKenna's obviously a winger too versus Celebrini and Bedard's being centers, although there are some who argue that Bedard may end up as a winger. So I think all of that's going to be interesting to track. Just what kind of freshman year does McKenna have? They have a very, very soft non-conference schedule at Penn State. When they're playing outside the Big Ten this year, it's frankly a bit of a joke. So they've really lined it up nice and cushy for him. But is he going to have the season closer to what James Hagan's had last year, the 37, 40-point range? Or can he reach for what Fantilli and Celebrini did, which was obviously 60? So that's kind of the barometer. I think he'll be in that 40 to 60 range. Obviously, what he's accomplished to date certainly grades him in line with any of the prospects who've come through in recent years. He was more productive than Connor McDavid in their equivalent seasons, and they're only a month apart in their birthdays. So what he accomplished in the WHL speaks for itself. CHL Player of the Year, CHL Rookie of the Year, yada, yada, yada. But he still does, when you talk to scouts about him, he still isn't viewed in that same sort of McDavid Bedard way that they were talked about. I think you're talking more about kind of a Jack Hughes level prospect here with McKenna. And then after that, it's because it's a very winger heavy draft, not just because McKenna's a winger, but you go down the list. There aren't many high-end centers outside of Tynan Lawrence of the Muskegon Lumberjacks. It's just not going to have that same sort of sex appeal, if you will, for NHL scouts. It's not going to have that same cachet because it doesn't have the premium position players. Now, there are some excellent defensemen, especially coming out of the WHL. There's a handful of first-round defensemen out of the WHL, including a couple of very, very, very high picks. But it just doesn't have as much juice as I think it was made out to have. I'll say that. Coming out of into the trade deadline last year, I think because people were starting to get disillusioned with the 2025 class being a little bit weaker, there was all sorts of talk by so-called experts into the trade deadline last year saying hang on to your 2026 picks. Teams are going to be more eager to trade their 2025 picks. I don't know at the end of the day whether 2025 and 2026 will be all that different as draft classes. I think Gavin McKenna is a better prospect than Matthew Schaefer at this stage. Certainly as we're speaking at the end of August here, I wasn't even necessarily the front runner to be first overall at that point, although the tides were beginning to go that way coming out of his excellent performance at the Hlinka Gretzky Cup. It never really fully shifted until the CHL USA Prospects Challenge last November. McKenna is obviously going to be the first overall pick. So that's a conversation that's already in and of itself different in this draft class versus a year ago with Schaefer. But we'll see. I don't think 2026 is special. I guess that's what I'm getting at.
Gotcha. All right. Now, second question here for you. So we've established Gavin McKenna, he's untouchable in terms of the first spot in this draft class. I mean, it's far and away right now him going to the NCAA in a position that Penn State is going to put him in. He's probably going to get a lot of points. It's safe to assume that 40 is a realistic ish goal for him to set. What I want to talk about is the second position in this draft. There's a lot of people that are seemingly able to push for that position. A lot of people say it's Keaton Verhoff. However, you on your list have Ivar Stenberg as the second best player in this draft. Can you talk a little bit about those two players, as well as also highlighting maybe some other players who could maybe slot into that second role, like Ryan Lynn, you mentioned Pine Lawrence, and maybe even Ryan Rubrek at that point?
Yeah, coming out of U18 Worlds, there was some chatter of, okay, maybe Keaton Verhoff can challenge Gavin McKenna in this draft class. He'd had an excellent year with the Victoria Royals in the WHL. He had an excellent U18 Worlds playing above his age group. He was obviously an underager at U18 Worlds in Texas. By tournament's end, he was their number one defenseman. He had a game that went into overtime where he made a big play in overtime and played 30 minutes in that game. And there was a lot of excitement about this big 6'4" defenseman who'd won a letter for Hockey Canada and had been a top player for Hockey Canada and was a summer birthday. He's a summer birthday, so he'll be 17 when he gets drafted instead of 18. Had scored 20 goals last year for the Royals. Then he made his commitment to North Dakota. And there was just this sort of swell, if you will, of excitement around Verhoff. I think his Hlinka tempered that a little bit, though. He was good at Hlinka. He was not clearly one of the best players at Hlinka, and certainly didn't dominate and take over games at Hlinka like Matthew Schaefer did a year ago at his Hlinka, right? So, and Matthew Schaefer was also a summer birthday who was on the younger side of that age group. So, actually, Matthew Schaefer was a September birthday, I believe.
Yeah.
That part of it is going to be an ongoing talking point. If Verhoff has a huge year at North Dakota and he's playing 25 minutes a night in college hockey as a 17-year-old defenseman, and he puts up, let's say, 20 points in 35 games and has a really respectable, really solid year, then I think you'll at least hear the conversation, because he's a 6'4" right shot defenseman, and the number one prospect in this draft class in McKenna is an average sized winger, right? So that's a conversation that some teams will probably have. I don't think that Verhoff is that high end a prospect, though. And I think Keaton Verhoff is a legit stud, potential sort of 1-2-3 NHL defenseman who can run a power play and all of that. But I also see average feet. I've seen him bobble pucks. And I just don't see that sort of high end yet. Now, the birthday makes it interesting because he's obviously got more runway to tap into that. He's 6'4". There are some who see sort of Alex Pietrangelo, Aaron Ekblad. They see that kind of a player in Keaton Verhoff. And if he becomes that kind of a player, then he's a worthy contender for first overall with Gavin McKenna. But I'm just not quite there. I'm not as excited about Verhoff as I was about Matthew Schaefer, for example. So I think we're talking more about, if you go back another year, right? I think we're talking more in the vein of Artie Levshunov and Sam Dickinson and those types from that 2024 class than we are maybe a Matthew Schaefer type or a Cale Makar type or that kind of a thing, right? So Rasmus Dahlin, that kind of a talent. I think Verhoff's a stud, but I just haven't quite been able to get to seriously considering him in the conversation with Gavin McKenna. Stenberg's a really interesting one because he's another winger, very, very high-end player. Ivar is a dynamic talent inside the offensive zone. He's also sneaky strong. He wins a lot of pucks on stick lifts, getting up and under pucks. I love his wall game. I think it's a real strength and a real asset of his, and he's going to excel sort of lifting pucks off of guys at the NHL level. Power play threat with the one-timer, can shoot it, can play make. Was very good for Frölunda in the SHL playoffs last year and is going to play against men again this year. Stenberg's a legit high-end prospect. Now, the only way I think he challenges McKenna is if McKenna has that sort of 40-point season instead of a 50 to 60-point one, and Stenberg is a point per game in the SHL, and he's stronger and he's physically thicker than McKenna. And then suddenly I think teams would have to at least have that conversation. But I would be entering the year, I would be pretty surprised if it's not McKenna.
Awesome. So I had a question about Verhoff. So, there are talks about, did he make the right decision by committing to going to the NCAA route as opposed to staying in the dub, which, I guess there's two trains of thought in that kind of scenario. So, I want to see what your take is. Was it, he could have played it safe and stayed in the dub, or, challenge himself a little bit better and, for his progression, I guess you could say, in terms of hockey, going to the NCAA route. What are your thoughts on that, Scott?
If I had been in his camp, I probably would have encouraged him to spend one more year in the WHL and then spend 1 year in college post-draft, and then you make your move from there. I think that's a sort of pretty proven line for a top defenseman to take. Some defensemen have spent 2 years, and in fact, many defensemen have spent 2 years in college. The ones who do go to college for their draft year, like an Owen Power, obviously have spent 2 years. Owen went back post-draft instead of directly into the NHL. I expect that he'll be there for a minimum of 2 years now that he's going in for his draft season. He's not going to be directly into the NHL a year from now. The interesting dynamic is that Victoria was poised to be one of the top teams in the WHL, and had him and Cole Reshny stayed for a year, they would have been a favorite in the WHL to challenge for the title and to go to a Memorial Cup. And I think that could have been really positive for Keaton. I think he could have benefited from playing more games. He's not a kid who needs the gym. The college part of the college benefit is fewer games, which means more time in the gym. Verhoff's not a kid who needs that. If you've ever sort of seen him or run into him, or you do at some point, he's a big kid. He's a big, strong kid already. Looks like a man already. So that part of it, I don't know. It's tricky because I think he's going to play really well in college, and I think he's ready for college, and he's going to have a strong year. So it's not as though going to college is something that I would advocate against. But I think of the two options, they're both good options, and I probably would have returned to the WHL, tried to win a WHL championship, and then you make your decision for your post-draft season from there with the consultation of your club. Ironically, James Patrick, who's the head coach of the Victoria Royals, is a North Dakota alum. So I don't think James was, as much as I'm sure I know James and that staff wanted to keep Keaton and Cole around. It would have been hard for James Patrick to advocate against Keaton Verhoff going to the place that he himself went to, right? So, and frankly, they've got a really strong track record, and now they're under a new coaching staff here, but North Dakota has a really strong recent track record of developing defensemen as well, led by Jake Sanderson, obviously, right? So he'll be in good hands, and it's a great program, and it's an unbelievable town, and one of the best barns in all of hockey, and the Ralph is a special place, right? So he's gonna have fun. He's gonna get the college experience. He'll be fine.
Absolutely. I agree with that last part with their development track record, especially with kind of improving the skating of not only their defensemen, but their overall skaters in general. At least I've found that they've made prospects better skaters, at least. So that's something for me that's positive going for him in his draft year. I now want to shift the focus of the discussion towards the top 10 and kind of like the general top of this draft instead of just the top 3. In your top 10, you have only 2 defensemen and 8 forwards. However, just on the periphery, just outside the top 10, you have 4 straight defensemen. So naturally, I want to bring this discussion back to like where we were starting with like comparing it to draft classes. Looking at 2024, it was obviously very defense heavy. Those big 6 defensemen that were at the top of the draft kind of dominated discussion. Do you think that 2026 will be more of a defense heavy top 10 or a more of a forward heavy top 10? Because there's obviously really good talents on both sides.
I think it will probably skew towards forwards and specifically all of those wingers. We haven't talked about Ryan Rubrick or Ethan Belkets or Adam Novotny, but there are some very, obviously, I mentioned Tynan Lawrence off the top. There are some very good forwards in that group. I expect that you'll see one of Carson Carroll's and Daxon Rudolph, maybe both, end up in the top 10. Carroll's has some real believers in NHL camps for sort of the pro style and pro makeup that he plays. I think he's going to be beloved by scouts, NHL scouts, more than maybe by public sphere scouts. I don't think he's necessarily going to put up the points that a Daxon Rudolph or a Ryan Lynn, for example, are going to put up, but Carroll's has a lot of believers already at an early age. Chase Reed, I think, has a chance, although Chase is a little bit on the older side, and I think that might work against him in terms of getting into the top 10. He would have to have another brilliant year for the Sioux, I think, to be in that sort of firmly in that conversation. The interesting one is Ryan Lynn, and he's interesting because we're coming out of a draft class in 2025 where not a single defenseman under 6 feet tall was drafted. Not just forget a top 10 pick. Not a single sub 6 foot defenseman was taken, period, in 215 picks or whatever it was in Los Angeles. Now, Cam Reed got pretty lucky. Cam Reed was listed at 5'11.75 heading into the combine and got that extra quarter inch. And obviously Cam Reed was a first rounder as a 6 foot defenseman. So that sort of leads me to believe that Lynn is going to have to be special in order to go top 10. I think he might be close. Like, I think we're talking about a Zeev Boyum caliber prospect. Now, Zeev, if you remember, did not go top 10 in the end, right? So I think maybe that's the more likely range. Zeev went, what was it, 11th or 12th?
He went 12 to Minnesota.
After the deal with Philadelphia, and then Jet Luchenko goes 13.
Yeah. Broke my heart.
That's probably the range where Lynn ends up. I think, despite the fact that I have Lynn at 4 on my list and that I believe he's in that 4 to 7 range pretty comfortably, for me personally, I think it's probably more likely that Lynn goes 12, 13, 14. And then the other one is Xavier Villeneuve, who is even smaller than Ryan Lynn at 5'10". And Xavier is being talked about a little bit like Lane Hudson was talked about. Xavier's ability to shake is pretty unique. He breaks ankles out there. He's got the head fakes and the shimmies, a lot like Lane Hudson did at the same age. But the WHL or the QMJHL, isn't viewed in the same light as the OHL and the WHL are. And as a result, I just don't know how exciting, no matter how good a year he has, and he's already the reigning QMJHL defenseman of the year. But no matter how good a year Villeneuve has as a 5'10", let's say he gets to 5'11", maybe if he grows an inch. I have heard that his dad is over 6 feet tall, so I think there's still some hope that he's going to get a little bit bigger. But let's say he finishes at 5'11", Ryan Lynn finishes at 5'11.5". I think Lynn is viewed as the better prospect. Villeneuve is viewed as the more talented sort of PP guy. Although I think both of them are going to be PP guys in the NHL, and I think the world of Ryan Lynn and the way he thinks the game, it just doesn't have that flash that Villeneuve has with the puck on his stick. So those guys are interesting. I think they'll probably both go in the first round. I think Lynn probably goes 10 to 15 somewhere, maybe top 10 if he has a huge year and people really fall in love with him the way I have. And then Villeneuve is probably late teens if he's lucky, but more likely sort of late first, maybe even late second or early second sort of thing. Cole Hudson, if you guys remember, went 35th overall, I want to say, to Washington.
Around there.
Olin Zellweger went 34th to Anaheim. I think that's kind of what we're looking at with Villeneuve. I could see him maybe going a little bit higher. Sam Girard went sort of in that similar range coming out of the QMJHL. I think Villeneuve is a little bit more dynamic than Sam Girard was at that age. So people forget Sam Girard was very talented in the queue. So that's the kind of prospect we're talking about. And then there's actually a third one in Axel Olofsson, who was excellent at the Hlinka Gretzky Cup for Sweden and has been very productive at the J20 level and is a very, very talented player in his own right. Another 5'10", 5'11" defenseman. But Olofsson isn't viewed in the same light, at least at this stage, that Lynn and Villeneuve are viewed in. So I think Olofsson's probably more likely a second or third round pick kind of thing.
Actually, I think I just read that Villeneuve at the camp for Blainville, Boisbriand there, he is listed at 5'11", and his dad is 6'2". So they're thinking that there might be some growth still to go there. So that might be some good news. Now, you were just speaking about Olofsson there, and I think that the Hlinka Cup just passed, obviously, and with that being said, Sweden had a great showing in terms of the point production for their team. USA obviously won the gold. Link was happy about that, right? So now, based on Hlinka kind of, is that first, major tournament that we kind of look at for these draft prospects. So is there any players in particular that you thought that kind of made a little bit of a jump in your rankings based on their play at the Hlinka?
Oh, it's a good question. I thought the Americans were really the surprise of the tournament. Team USA really typically struggles at this tournament. Jack Hextall was a player that I had a lot of time for coming in, but I thought Jack was excellent. He's also, as I mentioned off the top, not a lot of natural centers in this draft class. And I think because Jack is a natural center, that he's a first-round pick all day for me in this age group. But it was really the 2026, some of the 2027s who I hadn't seen a ton of. I had not seen Noah Davidson, for example, play hockey. I had not watched him at Shattuck last year. And I thought Noah looked like a stud, and he's obviously committed now to play at Medicine Hat, is going to play in Medicine Hat in the WHL this year. He's going to play there with Schaefer Gordon Carroll, another 2027 from that American Hlinka team. I knew a lot about Schaefer Gordon Carroll, having watched him on their Mem Cup run with Medicine Hat. I've spoken to a ton of people about Schaefer Gordon Carroll in the last year, but Davidson was one that I was sort of just getting introduced to, if you will. I like the two Swedes in Elton Hermansson. Oscar Holmertz is a slick little player and another center. Holmertz isn't viewed as a first-round prospect in this age group in the way that Hermansson and Nordmark are. But I thought Holmertz had a nice showing, and Holmertz really grabbed my attention for the first time in Sarnia at U17 Worlds a year ago. And then the Finns, I thought, like the Americans, this wasn't viewed coming into the Hlinka as a strong Finnish age group, coming out of a year in 2025, which was the worst Finnish age group that I've ever scouted doing this work. But I thought there were a few Finns at this tournament that looked like potential top 50 picks, looked like even maybe a first rounder or two in that group. Juho Pipparainen, who was sort of their number one defenseman, looks like a legit sort of 6'2" righty. And then their big, heavy forward line. They had a forward line. Their first line obviously carried them through the tournament, and they were all sort of 6'2", 6'3", 200 pounds. I thought Oscar Hemming played well, but it was the other two, Oliver Suvanto and Vanna Halto, who I thought really sort of impressed. Suvanto's a center, which helps. But Van Halto looked like a player. There were a few players from that Finnish team and from the American team that caught my eye. I've also got time. I thought he had a bit of a streaky tournament, but I've got a lot of time for Nikita Klepov with the Americans. I thought Levi Harper, who's another 2027, sort of really ran their first power play really well. He's going to Saginaw, which has obviously produced Zane Parekh and Pavel Mintyukov over the last couple of years. And I know Saginaw's excited about Harper. Harper's another 5'11" so that'll be his challenge. But if he can be dynamic in the way that Parekh or Mintyukov were, then he'll have a chance to be a fairly high pick. So those off the top of my head, those were kind of the names. But really, maybe the Finns actually more than the Americans. I thought Pipparainen looked like a real player. Samu Alulauri, who is their other sort of top defenseman, looks like a player. And then those three big boys up front, I'm now going to be keeping a close eye on them in the fall. But Suvanta, Wes Hemming, frankly, obviously Hemming's older brother Emil is a first rounder of the Dallas Stars. But the other two, I think Suvanto and Vanahalto look more interesting.
Gotcha. Bringing it back more to just outside of the tournament. So every year, there seems to be, I guess for the last 2 years, there has been a random player that kind of comes into the discussion and becomes that top 10 pick that at the beginning of the year you wouldn't have expected. Last year it was Brady Martin, became the fifth overall pick. I don't think anyone would have predicted that back in August. And then a year prior, Beckett Seneca with him going third overall. Is there anyone right now who is, I guess, outside of your top 15, just putting it right there, who you think could be that player that is a difference maker, has that huge year either in the CHL or in the USHL that can climb their way into a top 10, even top 5 spot?
There are two players that come to mind. One is number 15 on my list, so I'll cheat the parameters that you set there a little bit. But Marcus Nordmark, who we sort of just mentioned, I think Hermansen was viewed and has been viewed as the top player outside of Viggo Bjork in that 2008 age group, obviously. Stenberg's a 2007. Hermansen was viewed as sort of the guy there, and yet every time I've watched them internationally, both through their U17 schedule all of last year and at U17 Worlds in Sarnia, which I attended, and then this year at Hlinka, I've thought that Nordmark has looked every bit as talented as Hermansen, and I actually have Nordmark slightly ahead of Hermansen on my list. I think Nordmark's going to put up some numbers this year at the J20 level and potentially play in some pro games. He looks like he's got top 6 upside to me as a top 6 winger. And he's an option for the London Knights if he chooses to, because they own his rights through the CHL import draft, and I could see the London Knights being really positive for him. The sense I've gotten from talking to people is that they don't believe he's going there this year. It's pretty late now. Camps are opening. He hasn't yet signed in London. But I think there's a chance that he spends this year in Sweden and then plays in London the following year for his post-draft season and sort of takes that route, if you will. Nordmark's very, very, very talented, and he's got a little bit of jam too to his game. So I've got a lot of time for Nordmark. And then the other is a Swede, a late 07 Swede named William Haakonsen, who's a 6'4" defenseman. We've seen this trend amongst NHL scouts towards the big, mobile, athletic, physical, rangy defenders. And I think that's what Haakonsen is. We've seen the success that players like Caden Gooley and Braden Schneider have had. Lion Bixel broke into the league and played a regular shift with the Dallas Stars last year. That seems to be the priority amongst teams when they're looking for defensemen now, is sort of those big, physical, hard, competitive players. And Haakonsen is that. He's 6'4". He's got some real bite to him. He's physical. He's athletic. He can move. I don't know whether there's enough offense for him to get into the top 10, but I think Haakonsen will play in the SHL all year this year, or most of this year. That will help him. And he's going to be a player that a lot of teams make time for in terms of visits and video and all of that. So he's a player who I think could join that sort of Carroll's, Rudolph, Lynn tier of defensemen, if you will.
One more question before we wrap it up. There's one player that we haven't mentioned yet, and he is probably the highest rated centerman in this draft so far, and that's Tynan Lawrence. So what do you think of his game at the Hlinka?
I thought he was good for Tynan Lawrence. I didn't think he was great. I thought he had another level. He was better than his production. He was still a driver for them. He was still a go-to player for them. He still played in all situations for them and was their first-line center, obviously. And I thought there was a distinct gap between Tynan Lawrence as their center and everybody else that they played at center on that team, whether it was Alessandro Diorio or you go down the list. There was a clear separation amongst that center group between Tynan and everybody else. I thought his best game of the tournament was actually the game that they lost. So that was positive. I've got a lot of time for Tynan. There are folks, scouts, NHL scouts, who believe that Tynan could actually be the one more than Stenberg or Verhoff to potentially challenge Gavin McKenna for first overall in this draft class, because he's the 6'1.5", 6'1" center who skates really well and has skill and is wearing a C this year for Muskegon and won a championship with Muskegon last year and is viewed as a winning hockey player. Tynan's a stud. Like he's the unquestioned top center prospect in this draft class. Ryan Rubrick, despite being listed as a center, actually played wing in Niagara last year. Viggo Bjork's a natural center, but Vigo's 5'10", 5'11". This is if you're looking for a center, this is Lawrence's draft that way. So I expect him to have a huge year in Muskegon. I know there were a lot of people who questioned the decision to go back to Muskegon, but I respect it. Why would he chase going to the CHL when he can return to the USHL with the program that he just won a championship with and try to go back to back and win another championship in Muskegon, right? So before obviously going off to Boston University where he's committed. So I'm a big fan of Tynan. I think he's a stud. I'm not sure whether he's going to be a true first line center in the NHL, but I think he projects as a really excellent 2C, a lot like Caleb Desnoyers sort of fit that projection in last year's draft. I think Tynan's a higher grade prospect at this stage than Desnoyers, but that's sort of the conversation. I think that there are some similarities, some lines to draw between Lawrence and Caleb.
Awesome.
Right now, we have a new segment going on for this new year. We are going to include you guys in this segment. We are having our Guess the Prospect segment. We're going to have for every single episode. We are going to talk about a drafted prospect, an NHL affiliated prospect, and you guys are going to have to guess in the comments who it is. And we wanted to start it today by having Scott read off the clues for this prospect. So Scott, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, this player, the sort of inaugural player here is a first rounder from the 2022 NHL draft who played out of the NTDP and then committed shortly after the NTDP to play at the University of Michigan as a Wolverine.
All right.
All right.
So name that prospect. And you know what? We're a poor show right now, so we don't have any prizes. But maybe in the future we might be able to give some prizes out to if you can name that prospect. So I think that's it for this episode. Scott, thank you so much for joining us and just peppering us with all that 2026 prospect knowledge. It was awesome. Maybe we'll do it down the road again if you have some time, and appreciate you being on here for sure. Link, did you want to say anything?
I appreciate you sacrificing your time for us, Scott. I really appreciate it. Obviously, we're all in the midst of getting back into this, and this is a really exciting class. Whether or not we believe that it's the strongest class forever, I mean, we've been talking about these names for a long time, and I'm so excited to get underway. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, fellas.
All right. Cheers, everyone. We'll see you soon.